Hello, bonjour and welcome to your new Bonner Private Wines video. Have you ever had an old champagne wine, a 10-year-old bubbly or even 15 or 20 years old? Well, chances are you may not have, while I would imagine you had the opportunity to taste a 10 or 15-year-old red easily, right? So today I want to answer a question you're probably wondering about without having experienced it for yourself. Does champagne age well? Could you stick a bottle of bubbly in your cellar and forget about it for a decade or two like you would with a nice red, and it'll be great? Could it be the case for a champagne? Well, let's find out. In short, for a spoiler and a teaser all at once, let's say that most champagnes and other sparklings aren't meant to be cellared for a long time at least. Why? We'll explain in a minute, but there are certain specific conditions that do allow a good champagne to age beautifully and become something really, really special. Let's elaborate. You see, as we've talked about before, most bottles of champagne we buy come with no vintage on the label. No year is specified anywhere on the bottle. And that's because they are blended from wines made during several vintages and assembled together and mixed to achieve the famous consistency and house style of every champagne producer. Every brand has its own unique recipe made mostly of wine from one or two prior vintages and blended with a little bit of older vintage wines in it for depth and harmony. Those wines are called non-vintage because they don't have a vintage, they blended from different vintages. That's your Moet and Chandon, Veuve Clicquot, Bollinger, Taittinger, you name them. The truth is that those relatively affordable champagnes with no vintage aren't meant to be cellared for very long. They're crisp and vibrant when you taste them, quite fruity, citrusy, and that's how we like them and how they're supposed to be enjoyed young. If you age them for 10 years or more, well, they won't be bad, but they'll lose their vibrancy and not really gain a positive depth or a better harmony at all. They'll become waxy and quite heavy, spicy, strange. That said, if you forget a bottle in your cellar for 2-3 years, they contain enough bubbles, enough CO2 to protect them for sure and not become too nutty or waxy too quickly. They don't mind withstanding, say, 5 years of aging. At most, like most decent wines could support that, but not much more. The other type of champagne wines are those called vintage champagnes, featuring a specific year on the label. Those are not only made from one single vintage's grapes, but producers blend their very best vineyards grapes in them to make the very best wine, the very best cuvee that they can. And most prestige cuvee champagnes are vintage champagnes like Dom Perignon or Roederer's Cristal, but some vintage champagnes are not prestige cuvées, just very well crafted wines from one single year, while non-vintage start at around $50 and up to maybe $80. A lot of vintage champagnes are $100 and more. The prestige cuvées are $200, $300, $500 or more. So you have these different categories even within vintage champagnes. If you buy a vintage champagne today, it'll be a few years old already. Now in 2023, you'd buy a 15 or 16 or 17 vintage. Surprisingly, those vintage champagnes aren't meant to be aged much further by you in your cellar either. The year mentioned on the label is just there for you to know which vintage it is. Was it a warmer vintage, a colder vintage, one considered exceptional or less so? It's not really recorded on the label for you to track how old it is. Vintage champagnes you bought at your local wine shop aren't meant to be cellared for more than a few years either. So are there any bubblies that you can age, that can age well? And the answer is yes. The very best, most carefully crafted champagnes from the best vineyards, namely those vintage champagnes and prestige cuvées, can age gracefully, but they have to be matured at the winery by the producer itself. Let's explain. It's going to get just a little technical here for 30 seconds, but allow me that so you understand what's happening here. You see, after the second fermentation within the bottle, the fermentation that gives the wines its bubbles and that it retains within the bottle, the fizziness, champagne makers mature all their bottles on the lees, the little residues that you will find at the bottom of the bottles that are dead yeasts, much like you would find at the bottom of some craft beers. You've probably seen that. Well, at the winery they still have those lees. They also cellar those bottles in airtight metallic closures, much like a beer cap, which doesn't let any air in. Before shipping the bottles out of the winery to the retailers, producers replace these beer caps with the cork that you know and remove all the lees or deposits at the bottom of the bottles so you get these very nice and clear and transparent fizzy wine. And that's a process called disgorgement. The problem is that those lees in the bottle protect the champagne from oxidizing, and the cork, now when you have a cork, it lets some oxygen slowly get through and inside the wine and oxidizing it. Once you get the wine without its lees, it's very clear and under a cork closure, well, the wine is therefore not well protected anymore and it is not meant to age much further. Champagne can age for a very long time, but on its lees and under a steel cap closure. So only the wineries can age gracefully a champagne and preserve its freshness and crispness, also allowing it to develop depth in harmony. You can find aged champagnes, but they have to be released by the winery directly out of the champagne house's cellar after aging for a few years in their own cellars. Those are called the late disgorged vintage champagnes. In reality, those are extremely rare, very special releases, only boutique retailers may have some. They're very expensive too, but of exceptional quality because they were matured in those very specific conditions. If you're ever lucky enough to be invited at a champagne house for a dinner, well, they might serve you those old vintages that they have treasured in their own cellars, but it's a very rare and privileged experience. So yes, champagne can age, but you can't really get yourself all vintage champagnes unless you know what it is and you know a very specific wine shop and you're prepared to pay the price for it as well. If you want to learn more about champagne, the history, the styles and more champagne myths, you can watch that video right here. It's a few weeks old, a few months old in fact. And that was it for me today. I'll see you soon in the wonderful world of wine. Cheers.